So there came a point where I realized staying in my life as it was would cost me more than leaving it. And even though it took everything in me, I chose to step off the brink, not knowing if I'd fall or finally become who I was meant to be. There's a quote by Anais Nin that a friend just introduced me to, and it goes like this. And the day came when the risk to remain tight in a bud was more painful than the risk it took to blossom. And you know what? Every time I hear it, I think that's the moment, isn't it? That's the exact moment where something shifts. And that's not because we suddenly feel brave or not because we have a perfect plan, but because staying where we are starts to hurt more than changing. And I mean, I think most of us have lived in that bud stage longer than we realize. And, where everything looks fine from the outside, we're functioning, we're managing, we're holding things together. But internally, there's a tension, a tightness, like we're containing something that wants to move, but we're not letting it. And so we tell ourselves all the reasonable things like, it's just not the right time. I just need to figure it out a bit more. I don't want to make the wrong decision. So we stay. And not because it necessarily feels good, but because it feels familiar. So here's the myth about courage. We tend to think that change comes from this big, bold moment of courage, right? Like one day we wake up and we just know. But in my experience, it's rarely like that. It's much quieter and it's more like a slow accumulation of discomfort, that kind of growing awareness that something isn't aligned until eventually the cost of staying becomes undeniable. And I think that's exactly what Anise Nin is talking about when the equation changes. When staying small, staying contained, staying where you are actually becomes more painful than the uncertainty of change. And it's not that the fear disappears. It definitely does not go away. It's that something else becomes louder in you. That knowing, that restlessness, the sense that, you're meant to move. This really came into focus for me later in life in a relationship that probably from the outside looked pretty solid. And it had history and time invested and shared life. And for a long time, I told myself the right things, that relationships take work, that every long term relationship goes through phases, that maybe I needed to try a little harder, understand a little more, be a little more patient. And I stayed in that space for a long time. But underneath it, there was that same tightness, that, quiet, kind of persistent feeling that something wasn't aligned anymore. But there was also a very clear truth underneath it. Our values were not aligned. And once I could really see that, it's like something you can't unsee because values aren't something you can negotiate long term without it costing you. And that's where the shift started to happen in me. This growing sense of staying was costing me something, my energy, my aliveness, and parts of me that I feel I was slowly putting aside to keep things in the relationship intact. And I remember the shift. It wasn't big. It wasn't even this big, courageous moment. It was just a realization that it was starting to feel more painful to stay than it did to consider leaving. And that's a very different kind of clarity because, I mean, I was still really scared. And, you know, I was afraid of disruption, of hurting someone. And definitely there was a lot of fear around the unknown. But something inside me had already started to move. And I think that once that happens, it's very hard to go back to not knowing. So the decision didn't come from feeling ready. It came from recognizing that staying was no longer sustainable for me. And that was the beginning of everything opening up and not cleanly, not perfectly, but honestly. So for me, it took a tremendous amount of courage, every bloody thing I could muster. And I remember I was listening to this podcast, and the guest asked a question that just landed in a way that I couldn't ignore. And she said, looking ahead 10 years from now, how would you want that version of you to look back on the last 10 years of her life? And for me, the answer was immediate. I wanted something very different, more honest, more aligned with who I actually felt I was. And once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. So when I made the decision, I knew I couldn't let fear be my master. It honestly felt like stepping off the brink, like things could go either way, really not good, or everything I had quietly hoped for. And that's the part we actually don't talk about enough, because blossoming doesn't feel like it's safe in the moment. It feels like risk. But a few years later, I can say this. It was the latter. My life is becoming everything I had hoped for. And that 10 years from now version of me, she's become quite a guide and kind of a quiet cheerleader. And so far, I feel like I'm doing her proud. So here's the truth about blossoming. Blossoming isn't always graceful. It's not always beautiful and effortless. Sometimes it looks like making a decision before you feel you're ready or having uncomfortable conversations. Maybe it's letting things fall away that you once relied on. And maybe it's stepping into uncertainty without guarantees. It can feel really messy and really exposed, but it's also where life starts to move again. So most of us don't blossom because we suddenly become fearless. No way, man. We blossom because something inside us becomes unwilling to stay contained any longer, because the tightness becomes too much and the holding on to all that stuff becomes way too heavy. And we reach a point where we're ready to risk something in order to finally feel like ourselves again. And maybe that's the moment to trust, not because it's easy, but because something in you has decided it's time.